And then the guy saw a dark energy coming towards him right in front of him. Realizing that one of the main surprises was already here, suddenly the boy realized that someone had grabbed his leg, although a moment ago no one was visible there. And then, swinging his blade, he suddenly saw beneath him the one he had tried to save only a few days ago. It was Agatha, who said with tears in her eyes that a vile alchemist was to blame for her death. The guy didn't believe that the girl was alive, because he himself remembered her mother over the cold body of her daughter, whom she soon buried. But then Agatha plunged the blade into Henry's chest, and the boy realized that this vile blow was not accidental. The girl's sinister smile was different from the one she had in life, as if this devil had risen from the dead to take revenge for her death. The immortal spirit shouted to his ward that he must not give in to deception and stand still like a statue. But the guy couldn't take his eyes off this girl and began to blame himself for her death, as if something had clouded his mind. He even remembered the expression on her face the moment she became the only one who loudly supported him at the stadium, risking her own life. And now she suddenly suggested that he die with her, so that the guy would no longer suffer from guilt and would go to the world of eternal peace. From the very beginning, the immortal spirit warned that the Room of Illusions was capable of subjugating Henry's mind and was in a hurry to bring the guy to his senses. Even the Sky Fox noticed how vulnerable this guy was, although to her those past visions seemed like just a childish trick. But she wasn't going to let Henry die from deception easily, since she had taken it upon herself to teach this boy. However, Richard had already invested enough of his dark mana to permanently cloud the mind of this student and not let him out of his tenacious clutches. The image of Agatha still stood before the guy's eyes, and, shedding tears, the girl insisted that now he too had to die. But suddenly something changed, and instead of apologizing, the guy sharply waved his hand and threw it aside. The blow caused the girl's body to break through the stone fence, although everyone understood that there were only magical illusions around. Richard had never seen anyone deal with this dark magic before, and he didn't understand who had been helping the guy all this time. But this did not mean that this was the only method against Henry, and Richard decided to use another technique. And then suddenly images of people, well known to the guy but now hostile to him, began to emerge from the walls. And a moment later he saw Julia, Edward, and Catherine opposite him, silently looking at him from some ominous dark haze. Sky Fox knew how much power was needed for such illusions, and she was surprised that Richard still had enough magic. The girl immediately suggested using the power of unity to quickly defeat the copies. But the guy decided to wait and not reveal his trump cards. He felt the movement of the primordial chaos within himself, and his spiritual perception noticeably increased his abilities. Suddenly, a copy in Edward's form attacked him, and it looked exactly like the real Edward. But Henry easily dodged it, realizing that even if he killed the copy of his childhood friend now, his real friend would not be harmed. Therefore, now it was worth temporarily forgetting about friendship and remembering that in front of him were not his friends, but only created images. He began to chop with the magic blade in all directions, although Julia and Catherine looked strikingly similar to the real ones. But Richard was just waiting for the guy to retreat, seeing the faces of his loved ones in front of him and become easy prey. However, he miscalculated, because a few days before the meeting, the immortal spirit warned him about something like this, and the guy trained his will in advance. He easily destroyed all the copies in the room and loudly ordered Richard to come out of the shadows himself to fight him. But in response, he saw how the fence around him cracked, and the walls crumbled into small pieces, like broken glass. And then someone's hand appeared behind Henry, as if trying to pull him with it into the cold darkness. The hand almost touched him, but at that very moment the guy felt someone's presence and prepared to turn around sharply. It turned out that Sophia had been standing behind him all this time, and he saw in front of him not a dark room, but a familiar square near the estate. Indeed, it even seemed to him that he had not entered this building, but had remained outside with his friends the whole time. It was hard to believe, but Sophia kept telling him that they had missed a vantage point when he left them and entered the house. And then she added that now it was really all over for them, and there was no longer any chance of defeating Richard. But a moment later, a knife appeared in her hands, and with a terrible scream, she rushed at her boyfriend. It was good that Henry had already overcome his illusions, and was now ready to strike with a blade the girl who only looked like Sophia. It was difficult to understand how he managed to react to this attack, but from her look it was clear that she was not at all as kind as the real one. Now nothing could stop him or make him believe the lies born of the Room of Illusions. Besides, his real girlfriend always preferred to wear white shorts, and at the moment of the fall, the guy, by pure chance, managed to notice different underwear on her. Richard could not come to terms with the reason for his failure, because his illusion technique usually never failed and worked perfectly. But instead of the corpse of this alchemist, In the center of the room stood a guy whose energy exceeded the strength of even the 10 strongest warriors. After being stabbed in the chest, Henry somehow felt intense pain, even though there was not a scratch on his body. Turning to his spirit helpers, he asked what this illusion room really was and what harm it could do to his mana. But the immortal spirit was more concerned with the question of how the guy knew what kind of underwear Sophia was wearing. However, the main question now was what kind of ability he should use in an open fight with the one who had challenged him to this mortal combat. Turning around, he saw that Richard was already in the room and seemed to have given up hope of fighting, hiding in the shadows. And now it was time to use all the energy of the sacred blade to pierce Richard's heart with this weapon. Taking a fighting stance, he shouted that Richard's family had never fought with illusions, and asked where Richard had gotten that power. But it is unlikely that he would have revealed to the guy his secret connection with Edward, who gave him blood to drink, forever linking him to the dark side. It seemed that only one fighter would survive this fight. And now everything was decided only by the strength that each of them hid within themselves. As soon as they crossed swords, the entire mansion burst into bright light, as if thousands of armies were clashing against each other. It turned out that the blade that Edward gave Richard before the battle was not just a weapon, but was as if specially forged against Henry's relic. If he hadn't been training all this time, he could have easily missed this strong blow and died on the spot. But this didn't happen. Even Richard, who knew the true power of this alchemist, expected that his artifact would help him deal with him. But the guy seemed ready to fight without magic. The threefold spiritual principle and the 7 unclean spirits were about to appear here, because this guy was already ready to begin the purification of the soul. He was not mistaken, because Henry gradually began to change his appearance, increasingly resembling a monster in a human body. Without wasting any time, Richard rushed straight towards him to prevent the transformation and save his chance of winning. But Henry was ready to fight to the last, and was just waiting for the right moment to use all his energy. The power seemed to be bursting out of the guy's body, and from the outside it seemed as if he was completely engulfed in the flames of hell. But all these movements were too slow for the magician who linked his life with the Dark Clan, and could foresee any move of the opponent. Although it was clear from the guy's appearance that it took him a lot of effort to develop such incredible speed, all that was left was to hope that the accumulated energy would last until the end of the battle, and that Henry's abilities would not leave him ahead of time. After all, the longer he fought, the stronger he became, and it felt as if the guy was being helped by many heroic souls of the past. If Henry's soul purification had already been completed, Richard would have lost long ago, so it was impossible to allow him to reach the peak of his abilities. Looking back, Henry realized that his friends could be in danger, so he needed to end this fight as quickly as possible. Now there were only the 2 of them left, and nothing could stop one of them from winning and ending this long conflict forever. He loudly ordered the Heavenly Fox to prepare for the merger, because with her help, he could not only see the hidden, but also awaken his secret power. Richard had no choice, and he took out of his pocket the small container of mutant blood that Edward had given him before the fight. He said that this was the blood of a monster from a high ancient family, and it would help Richard create a body equal in strength to Henry. He was not going to wait any longer, and throwing his head back, drank to the bottom this small bottle with the blood of a terrible monster. But the power that already emanated from the young alchemist was astounding, because only God could control so many elements at once. However, the magic of the blood he had drunk began to work, and after a couple of seconds, Richard felt his whole body changing from the inside. At first, he was seized by hellish pain, and he himself wanted to cancel the effect of the magic, but it was too late to change anything. And then he felt a surge of rage, and before his eyes appeared the image of his dead son, for whom, out of revenge, he was ready to drench the whole world in blood. It was hard to imagine that Richard would decide to do something like this, because there was no way back and he had forever doomed himself to the appearance of a mutant. Soon the clothes on his body were scattered in different directions in small rags due to the monstrous transformation. But at the last moment, the guy warned that Richard, like any person, would not be able to control this power and made a mistake by taking such a step. But now, instead of Richard, another creature was speaking, completely taking over not only his body, but also his consciousness. Now he looked at the world through a red veil, and for the death of his son, he was ready to tear Henry to pieces right now. Even if he ended up becoming a mindless zombie, he was still willing to do what his fatherly duty told him to do. That blade was a serious threat to Henry because even his artifact couldn't completely resist it, and now this monster had it. Surely Edward had planned this abomination in advance, and he did not feel sorry for Richard, who believed him and accepted the relics of the dark forces as a gift. And now, instead of the usual appearance of a businessman, the guy saw in front of him an enraged mutant who was not even aware of himself. However, the monster himself liked such power, and for the first time he felt the power capable of crushing any enemy in his path. The curse of the witch's blood increased his physical strength and, in addition, increased Richard's speed many times over. At the last moment, Henry asked the Sky Fox to increase his perception to the maximum, just like he had done in the fight against Ronald. A moment later, Henry's appearance also changed, and the guy was ready to use all the elements under his control in this battle. Without hesitation, he rushed at Richard, who had ceased to be human, and all that was left was to kill the mutant that he himself wanted to become. But the monster rushed back at the guy, and it became clear that dark magic was strong and killing the monster would be more difficult than Henry thought. His blows were so fast that the guy barely had time to react and dodge the enemy's sharp attacks. With each new attack, he seemed to increase his speed, and it was unclear whether there was even a limit to his speed. Of course, Henry was also prepared for this, and seizing the moment, with one wide movement, he delivered an accurate blow straight into Richard's chest. Although it seemed that the blow did not harm him, but only further inflamed his desire to fight to the last drop of his blood. Only a skilled mage like Henry stood a chance against Richard's current form. But the coming battle with the mutant horde would be even more serious, and this fight was a great opportunity to use all his skills and prepare for what he was reborn for the second time. But to his surprise, the blade of Henry's sword was cut off after the first serious attack from his opponent, leaving only a fragment in his hand. It was hard to believe that Richard had enough strength to cut through the sacred blade. But there was no time to think. After all, the monster was already close, and without the help of the artifact, this duel could have turned into a real tragedy for the young alchemist. And then the mutant hit the guy on the floor with such force that he almost broke through him, and a loud bang was heard throughout the area. For the first time in a long time, Henry felt such a powerful magical blow, and did not remember when he fought with such an opponent. In fact, the fight cannot be considered equal, because Henry had two spirits on his side, and Richard was assisted by an entire army of dark warriors. From the very beginning, Richard advised him to surrender. But now it was too late, and the boy could only accept death as befits a warrior. Although this monster didn't seem to be happy about the victory, and Henry understood that he was actually suffering, having become an evil mutant. The guy was right, but Richard had no choice, because his son was dead and the family was destroyed by circumstances. Besides, now he himself has become a walking corpse, and all because of a girl who has nothing to do with him at all. Then he suddenly said loudly that deep down he regretted everything he had done, but now nothing could be turned back. But instead of support, the guy said that pity is only for the weak, and he was disgusted to see Richard's behavior in the face of death. Hearing this, he suddenly thrust his sword forward and demanded that the guy repeat these words again. Suddenly he gathered his last strength and, standing on his feet, declared that he never regretted anything in his life. Of course, now the guy had a pitiful fragment in his hands. But even with its help, he was ready to fight until the very end of this battle. And then he declared that for the suffering of innocent people, the guy sentenced Richard to death and was ready to carry out the sentence immediately. Even with the strength that Richard had, he would not have been able to rise after such a blow, and realized that the guy was even stronger than they said about him. However, he was ready to go to the end, because this man, who had become a zombie, now had nothing to lose in this life. Finally, both spiritual mentors shouted to the boy that the Heavenly Fox was already ready to use the false moon for his quick escape from the battlefield. But he didn't seem to be planning to leave or end the fight by running away, and even fought with the broken piece of his sword, as if he had the former sacred artifact in his hands. This guy actually managed to repel Richard's powerful attack, and he looked with fury in his eyes at the one who surpassed even him in strength. Besides, the guy behaved so calmly, as if he felt the entire space around him with every cell of his body, and he didn't need to look to see. It was hard to say how much power the student had, but it grew with his body every second, and could soon reach the size of his opponent. Indeed, Henry's appearance was changing before the eyes of the Sky Fox, but she understood that this was not happening under the influence of her magic. At this moment, the immortal spirit remembered that the true chaos technique only developed the human race to completely recreate the power of the first human. And now the unity characteristics of his ward have grown by 10% at once. Although at the peak this figure did not exceed 5%. This could only mean one thing. This young man's true chaos body was evolving again, and he could reach an even higher level than in his first life. He then quietly told Richard that he owned the Soul Hall. But that wasn't the only reason he couldn't lose this fight. After all, his entire past life he fought against the same monsters that he now sees before him, and past actions could endow his new body with their energy. Even the immortal spirit, who had lived many more lives than the young man, was surprised at how much knowledge was actually stored in this student's head. But the monster still didn't understand what Hall of Souls the guy was talking about and where he read all this nonsense. However, it was worth believing him, because an ordinary person is not able to control all the elements at once and grow in level right before your eyes. The spirits of ancient heroes always had a difficult character or a difficult fate, but all of them, without exception, followed the path that they considered right. And although everyone considered Henry a brilliant alchemist who had gained influence over many famous people, there was something hidden in his heart that he did not speak out loud. After all this time he dreamed of simple joys and wanted only to calmly spend the rest of his days with his beloved Sophia. However, every time he closed his eyes, the stories of the heroes, their path, and the guy still missed them very much. Yes, there was a feeling as if the student had matured in one day and spoke not like a teenager, but like the wisest god of the universe. And even if his body is shackled, the feeling of love has to be suppressed, and the whole world turns against him. He will never stop. Hearing this, the spirit finally realized that he was not dealing with a first-year student, but with a magician who had lived thousands of lives and was perhaps older than himself. And right at that moment, Henry finally managed to overcome the period of soul purification, and this stage was completely completed. For the monster, this meant only one thing, but he was not going to give up after listening to one tearful story from the boy. After Henry's first attack, the monster realized that if he fought this guy alone, he would most likely only die. It was difficult to understand the nature of this power, but Richard had no doubt that Henry was not an ordinary man. None of the students at the academy could even think of learning to control all the elements at once. Suddenly, the guy had another vision, inside which he found answers to many of his questions. In his mind, he clearly saw the day when one of the settlement's chief alchemists was honored to meet the ruler himself. Looking around, he at first did not understand why the ruler had come to him, since other masters could easily be found in the empire. However, this man was the best alchemist in the Celestial Empire, so the ruler wanted to ask him to forge the most powerful sword in history. And seeing a crowd of soldiers surrounding his family from all sides, the alchemist realized that he had no choice. However, he warned that such a goal would require much more time than the emperor thought. At parting, the ruler asked that the work be completed in exactly 3 months and said that he would eagerly await him at the palace. But to forge such a weapon, it would take at least 3 years to temper it, and he wouldn't have even prepared the materials in 3 months. His wife knew the ruler's character, but the blood of the supreme rulers since the beginning of the empire flowed in his veins, so the best choice would be to cast a magic sword. It was not for nothing that this man bore the name of the first alchemist, and if he promised, he intended to see it through to the end. After that, they set out on a journey, at the end of which they cast 2 magic swords at once. But this took more than 3 years. When everything was ready, the man said that he was already waiting for death, because after appearing at the palace, he would be killed immediately. With tears in her eyes, the wife was ready to do whatever her husband asked, especially since they were seeing each other for the last time. Once at the reception, the emperor reminded that instead of 3 months, 3 years had passed, and that violation of the order was punishable by death. Even though the alchemist had come with the blade, he still had to speak his last words before he died. Holding a bundle with his almost finished work, the alchemist asked as his last wish to borrow the imperial forge for a short time. This was not difficult to accomplish, and soon they found themselves in the forge where the best craftsmen of the empire worked. Looking down into that hellish flame,